little bit because that's exactly what you expect for the example. So I think if we understand these things, we can deal with it, and that's why the hypothesis is so important.
I just want to comment on that also is if you can't stand it, when you review paper, tell the author to convert. But this is the problem because, you know, every time I review a paper, it's in relative percentage, and then sometimes it doesn't mean nothing because of the population they're studying. So that's why we put this, we wanted to be clear on that, and we want the people to use this paper to leverage their opinions and to leverage that if they don't feel comfortable with the data, at least they have something to refer to for the author to say, hey, you should, this is a recommendation now, you should maybe follow that. So maybe it's not appropriate for every paper, but we want the people to use the paper that we wrote for at least telling that there's data over there and you can reference to that.
Actually, I had one last small question. This is actually for you, Melanie. Was, you know, in that picture that was shown a couple of times where, my goodness, there's already 8% DHA and EPA in the background fatty acids if you're in Norway versus only 4% in America. And I think that's going to come back to how you interpret results of a study, let's say with CVD risk, where, well, you know, you've already saturated, giving you more isn't going to help. And so understanding how you're going to take in consideration the background fatty acid composition of the diet needs to be very much incorporated when interpreting results.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So that's why it's so important to have all the data and to at least report what's the dietary background and whether there are other lifestyles that could modify the fatty acid profile in blood. So this is absolutely important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Xuefeng Hu from University of Ottawa. My question may be a little bit beyond this paper, but I think regarding the reporting. I mean, given the inconsistent reporting right now, is there any recommendation if we want to combine the studies, different studies, like both some reported circulating fatty acid, some report fatty acid supplement, like how we can combine the two type of studies? They are investigating the same topic.
I'll take a crack at it. Part of the inspiration for doing this project is the inability to actually put them together. So if people report everything, you can put it together the way you want to put it together and analyze it. And it's not just the primary authors who are looking at it. You can also say, oh, I don't like the way they did that. I'm going to look at something else. And that we're all used to secondary data analysis now. There's nothing wrong with doing that with a paper. That would be my response.
Just a quick follow-up. Okay, please.
Well, just to say that sometimes what we're really interested in is the degree of change. So even if you have one paper looking at blood spots and another looking at RBCs, there may be some utility in at least comparing the offsets due to a dietary intervention. So, and I say that with caution. It's better to have the same method on the same GC, but yeah, there's maybe some latitude there to look at change, but obviously looking at net endpoint numbers from different methods, I think, yeah, have to be careful about doing that.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Right now, is there a robust whatever ratio or value or equation to convert the supplement with the change in circulating fatty acid? Because I see some individual studies, but not a robust review or something like that.
So I would say I'm going to answer that by saying that we sort of steered away from that kind of thing because we're recommending what things ought to be reported and thought through rather than recommending use this method or use that kind of a conversion or something like that. So that's a way of sort of saying that maybe that's recommendations 2.0.
Okay,
thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Martha Billery from OSU, Ohio State University, and I really appreciate this paper finally coming out because we've been dealing with this thing, especially about comparative placebos for years. So my question, though, is many of the oil companies we work with really don't have the capacity to synthesize placebos. They just don't. We all know nutrition is not a high-end market that profits very well. So do you guys have any advice on that? We particularly like to use the typical American diet kind of oil.
Yeah, I've been discussing.
So the recommendation here is optimize your sample integrity during storage. So the details of sampling and storage should be reported, including timing between sampling and analysis, storage temperature, duration, and any protective agent or antioxidant being used. The next part is taking the sample out of the freezer and actually doing something with it. So that's the sample chemical processing. And again, if you take a look at the literature, there are myriad ways that you can extract and derivatize. And this is really, the old Fulch and boron trifluoride methylation procedure that we've all used for so long. That's just one way of so many. So you can have lipid extraction methods that are comprehensive, Fulch, Bly, and Dwyer, or targeted. So using methanol or hexane will recover specific lipid classes within your sample. Then derivatizing. Do you split off the fatty acids? Do you saponify first, or can you methylate directly? Do you use an acid or do you use a base? What type of reagents? What length of time? These are all considerations that the article goes into. I don't have time to fully explore them, but you need to take some careful consideration here. There are one-step methods as well. Lepage and Roy, for instance, direct transesterification method, which we use. But one does have to be careful about these. They're certainly not appropriate for some samples. For some tissue samples, for instance, you just won't see a proper reflection of the actual fatty acid distribution there. So our recommendation here is basically you want to prepare your sample fit for purpose. So the method used to extract fatty acids and derivatize them to fatty acid methyl esters should be explicitly stated and a reference be made to the original studies provided. The quality of the method also needs to take into account other situations as well. So particularly if this is a new method, if you're departing from something that's very much standardized, you need to validate it. You need to compare it to established methods. And on the right-hand side over here is an example for here's whole blood and the breakout of different fractions for phosphatidylserine. If you use a dried blood spot, what you find is you actually see the phosphatidylserine retained on the filter paper. So you have to homogenize it over here in the column B and homogenize and acidify to ensure that you can extract all the phosphatidylserine. So without those steps, if you were to use the dried blood spot, the DBS, alone, you would underrepresent that category. Internal standards. Again, analytical chemistry guidelines are to be used here. The standard has to reflect the lipid of interest. So a fatty acid, for instance, that is not commonly found, that is provided at an equivalent concentration as you expect. You may wish to have multiple standards as well. You may wish to put in a standard before you do the extraction, and then have a second standard at the point where you add it to introduce it into the GC. That way you can parse out what your efficiency is of your extraction methylation step and still have a quantification of peaks accurately. So the recommendation here is that the rationale and procedure for the internal standards should be reported when it is used. The third aspect is the analytical chemistry itself. And as I mentioned, capillary columns have really taken us a long way. 30 meters are great. 100-meter columns enable more fatty acids to be evaluated. But we have options, obviously, gas chromatography with flame ionization detector or GC with mass spec detectors. LCs, liquid chromatography with mass spec or even MS detection. Shown over here on the right is a temperature flow or a temperature gradient pattern that has to be set and established. And basically, the bottom line is you have to report this in sufficient detail that you can unequivocally establish the fatty acid detail and resolution, identity and resolution if you repeat this. So recommendation is comprehensive analysis is important. When LC-MS is necessary, panels of fatty acids encompassing at least the same range that are routine in the GC should be analyzed qualitatively and quantitatively. Basically, GC FID is optimal, is what our finding was, but other methods can certainly be used. However, the responsiveness has to be characterized. So for GC FID, there's not always a linearity in terms of the injector. Usually the detector is fairly linear, but one has to calibrate with an external standard at different concentrations. For GC-MS applications, again, the responsiveness can vary. Here you can see better linearity with injectors, but you have to be sure that response factors are calculated and applied in terms of ensuring linearity of response. And this was actually identified long ago by Arnis Kuxis in his paper in Chemistry Reviews. So just comparing GC detectors, again, the GC-FID detector typically provides a good linearity of response and is robust. For GC-MS, you have to obviously confirm, it allows you to confirm the analyte identity, but it can require calibration curves for each fatty acid. And we understand that is a large undertaking, but it's an important one. So for GC-MS, the issues are a little more complicated because, as you can see over here, you don't have linearity of response. You have to actually predict it using a set of calibration curve standards. Assessing the method also involves taking a look at your peaks. This got a whole lot better with the advent of capillary columns, but each peak represents a different fatty acid. You really need to try to strive to have baseline separation. It can be difficult if you've got multitudinous, many different analytes, that is fatty acids. Again, go compare to established methods. Look at setting the temperature ramps such that you can tease out the peaks that appear not to be giving you baseline separation. You also want symmetry with peaks. Asymmetrical peaks suggest problems with detectors or usually bad column or flow rates. So ensure the peaks are symmetrical. Unknowns, we really should strive to try to know all the fatty acids in a mixture. So often we don't, and I'm going to come to this in the final point about data reporting. But there are so many peaks in a chromatogram, it's tough to be able to identify them all. But a thorough lab should strive to identify all peaks, either using mass spec or different internal standards or other applications. So the recommendation here for fatty acid identity is the identity of all fatty acid methyl esters must be established for the accurate analysis and methods reported in the paper or supplementary materials. And there's some great standards out here for those that can see. These new Czech standards really have an amazing array. So using blended multiple standards, one can identify the majority of peaks and ensure baseline separation. The other issue is when you're using a simplified technique, and there are many of them out there, not only for preparation as mentioned, but also for the analysis, be sure that you cross-validate it to an established longer-term technique. So here you see a paper with Ken Stark and Norm Salen, authored by Arthur Mazood, that is a simplified and efficient method for analysis of fatty acid methyl esters. A lot of us used this when it came out in 2005. It basically took a 45-minute run shown on the top panel and converted it with pretty much the same quality of the chromatography in the bottom panel down to as little as 8 minutes. But again, buyer beware. We tried applying this once to studying different organs and even food fats, and it absolutely will not give you representative fatty acid profiles. So you have to be sure that any shortcut, if that's what you might want to call it, to improve on efficiencies will validate, and it's certainly not appropriate for all applications. Acknowledging the limits of your method. This is really around the fact that you have so much variability in the size of peaks. So particularly for some of the polyenoic peaks and some of the monoenes, the levels are extremely small. So what is your limit of detection is really what this section is about. You need to be able to identify where your cutoff is. What do you call a minimal detectable limit for your minor peaks? So limits or detection or lower limits of quantification should be reported when fatty acids are not detected or quantified is the recommendation for that. And then monitoring analytical performance is also extremely important. So quality control needs to be established, and there are certainly a suite of standard reference materials. So the NIST standard reference methods, 1950, which is a single suite of fatty acids, or 2378, which is a grouping of different fatty acids, can be used to monitor your performance and look for resolution, look for peak separation, look for baseline separation. Working standards, obviously your fatty acids need to be in the range of the study interest. We referred to that before. And then you have to ensure that your instrument, your column, your injector, detector are clean and appropriate is extremely important. And you really should do a QC batch, quality control sample, either with every batch of fatty acids run, or it's recommended per 100. So the overall recommendation is reports should specify the quality control procedures used for sample analysis to ensure consistency across batches. Very important for studies where you're looking for small changes, small anticipated changes in fatty acid profiling. Okay, the last of the four elements here today is on reporting. And as Ken Stark put it here, this is really around confusion of tongues. It has to do with the fact that when you take a look at the literature, particularly if you're trying to amass different studies and synthesize the data and tabulate, unfortunately, it is highly variable what is out there. And this was really the impelling point that led us to really want to tackle this whole question from the analytical standpoint. How do you report this? So there are a number of issues in this. What is out there right now? Well, right now, it's usually either percentage of sum total, and we'll get into what that total will be, or it is an absolute, so a concentration, a molar level. And so these studies really are highly variable in terms of what's reported out there. Typically, greater percentage of total, but there are lots of folks who believe that concentrations, sheer quantitative measures are better, but it appears though there's higher variability in that. So when in a systematic review of taking a look at exactly this in fatty acid data from healthy adults, this is a review that was done by Ken Stark, published in 2016. You can see over here, what it shows is that of all blood fractions, 78% of the reports that he was able to take a look at presented the data as weight percent, 12% as weight per volume, and then 5% as moles per volume and 5% as moles. So fairly variable. And then you can see the split when you take a look at the different fatty or different pools that were looked at as well. So it's variable overall. The recommendation of the group in terms of fatty acid units is the rationale for primary reporting of fatty acid profile or absolute fatty acid concentration should be reported with respect to the hypothesis. That actually doesn't say a whole lot, but give some sort of reason for why you're reporting the way you do. Common language can certainly be of benefit, and in terms of the reviews that are out there, it looks as though there's been an attempt to standardize or convert the data to relative weight percent. And that makes sense because that's what the majority are actually presented at. So 78% of data are already existing in that format. Unfortunately, some of the studies just don't possess the information needed to convert the data from concentration to percent. So some of them are missing the total fatty acid concentration overall. So in a review recently, there was a loss of 26 lines of extracted data out of 398. That is 6.5%, mostly due to reporting of only a few select fatty acid concentrations. So without the total fatty acid concentrations provided in moles, you can't calculate that percentage. So the recommendation in terms of the ability to interconvert whatever data you are publishing is, regardless of your choice of primary reporting method, all reports should obviously contain enough information to convert relative to absolute and vice versa. So make sure that someone who wants to add your data to a meta-analysis can do that change. So when we take a look at the studies that are out there, different studies report different numbers of fatty acids. In some of the reviews, the average out in the majority of studies right now is 9.4 plus or minus 5.8 fatty acids are reported for each study. 30% report less or equal to only 5 fatty acids, and 2% of studies report only EPA and DHA. So it's really hard to parse those data back into another type of database if you don't have a comprehensive suite of information. The relative reporting should be expressed in terms of a total. And of course, it's about the denominators, I'll just point out in a moment, but total fatty acids really varies, and we'll dig into that. So the fewer fatty acids you have, basically you impact what a percentage will be. So the greater the percent of any one fatty acid is of a smaller denominator. So the recommendation here in terms of the fatty acid base, or the total number of fatty acids to be looked at, is that at least the base of total fatty acids used to profile the calculation should be specified. And develop a list based on the literature is one of the suggestions. So use either the National Institute of Standards and Technology Fatty Acid Quality Assurance Program. So there are exercises that's you can access that at www.nist.gov, and that is basically where 14 labs analyzed a series of reference materials and produced that base of fatty acids. Also, Ken Stark took a look at a series of studies in his paper in Progress in Lipid Research in 2016. So you can see the numbers of studies there: 122 with erythrocyte data, 107 with plasma total lipid data, and 118 with plasma phospholipid data. Again, you can see what the base is. And on the right-hand side here again, if the denominator is too small, your relative contribution in terms of percent will be too large. And here is basically the output from these reviews in terms of actual fatty acids to include in that base for percentage calculations. So of the fatty acids that are generally present in samples at greater than 0.3%, there are actually 22 of them listed here. These are the main common fatty acids. If you get down into the range of 0.1 to 0.3%, you can add another 7. So these ones, and if you are really trying to determine even the most minute amounts of fatty acids, and you add this list in column 3, 16 more, that's a total of about 45 different fatty acids. I mean, that's optimal for the base, but most studies would be looking at something around column A or column A and B. And as we saw, a lot of studies in the literature actually only report 10 fatty acids. But optimally, one would try to strive for what's in column A, around 22 fatty acids if possible. And it would be nice to have commonality in that base, so that denominator is standard, so the percent of each fatty acid relative to the denominator is consistent across labs and across studies. So the recommendation here in terms of the fatty acid base is that the range of fatty acids, particularly those in category A, should be reported to enable secondary calculations and interpretation. So that's it. I would just offer as a final comment that I think the 4 elements of analysis, that is sample collection, sample preparation, analysis, and particularly data reporting, all need to be done in a way that is well documented, that adheres to existing literature norms, and is properly described and articulated in any manuscript that one is submitting for publication. So we hope that, that this component of and we hope that this manuscript will be of value to you as you work your way through fatty analysis. Thank you very much for your attention.